Hello and welcome to Sunshine for Your Life. I've made a number of trips to the Middle East and I've always loved them. I've loved all my trips. I love the Middle East. And I thought it would be kind of nice for me to describe my first trip, because when you go overseas, you have to kind of go with the flow. And a lot of things happened on that first trip that make you kind of trust the process, trust that you're going to be all right. So on my first trip, we left New York City. We were supposed to leave New York City, and our plane was stuck in Amsterdam with engine trouble. And so the tour company gave us tours of New York City 2 or 3 times. We were around New York City. I saw a lot of things, some of them which were not good, some of them which were good. And then after that, we stayed in our hotel, and the next day we went to the airport, and our plane was still stuck in Amsterdam with engine trouble. That made a lot of people afraid. They're afraid because they'd never traveled internationally before, and this was my first trip internationally, and they thought, well, we could have an accident, we could have a terrible airplane accident, it could crash on us, because every time we checked with the airlines, the plane was still in Amsterdam with engine trouble. That didn't bode well for us. But, you know, I talked to my mother, and she said, if the airplane can make it from Amsterdam to New York City, it probably will be able to make it back. Well, I wasn't going to quit the trip, but a lot of people were thinking about just going home and forgetting about it because they felt so uncomfortable with that. But at any rate, we all made it. Nobody left. Nobody went home. Everybody stayed together. And what they did was send another plane from Amsterdam to New York City to pick us up and then go back. And where we went was Jordan. Our first stop was Amman, Jordan. We were traveling on Aliyah, which is part of the Royal Jordanian Airlines. The airline is just called Aliyah. So finally we made it, and we went to Amman, Jordan. And then our next stop was to cross the border from Jordan into Israel. So we went in a bus, and the bus went to supposedly go to Israel. We got to the border, and we stopped on the Allenby Bridge. This is a very, very high military area. And we found that there are men all around us with guns. And I want to say, when we stopped in Jordan and went into the hotel, the same thing happened. I looked out the window, and I found out that there were all kinds of men standing in a circle, completely surrounding the hotel, which was not a 4-star hotel. We'd missed the hotel because we were a day and a half late. And what happened was they had guns, they were ready to shoot, and all around the hotel it was like that. And it was kind of a seedy hotel anyway. It wasn't the best. But at any rate, we got past that. We went to the Allenby Bridge. We stopped on the Allenby Bridge because the air conditioning in our bus had stopped, and therefore it was like 120 degrees in there, and I don't do well in heat, neither do a lot of other people, so they let us off the bridge. We weren't allowed to go anywhere. Most people, because it's a borderline between Jordan and Israel, most people aren't even allowed on the bridge. They just have to drive over it, and it was an old rickety bridge. Now it's been rebuilt and it's new, but it's an old rickety bridge, and we just could stand there and walk around, and we were allowed to buy sodas. So just as an added thing, I decided to bring back some of the soda bottles that I had when I was in Israel. And the first one I want to show you is the orange drink. If you can get a close-up of this. This is the orange drink that I had while I was standing on the Allenby Bridge. Now, why do I want to show it to you? Because I just want you to see the writing on this bottle, if we can get a close-up of the writing. I don't know if we can or not. It's a Schweppes orange, and it has both Israeli writing, and it also has Arabic writing on it, and you can tell the difference between them. The writing from the Hebrews looks always squarish, and that's just the way that it looks. The writing for the Aramaic, that's much better. The writing for the Arabic is always kind of like a curvy, scrolly one, but this is the orange bottle containing orange soda, and it's a Schweppes, but it's the Israeli version of it. The other thing I want to show you is a Sprite bottle, and this is in Hebrew. if I don't know if you can get a close-up of it, the Hebrew, this is the way it looks. Now you can see the sprite on the top. If I swing it around to the other side, you can see that it's sprite. But this is the writing that we saw when we bought it. This is the Israeli writing on it for sprite. The other one I want to show you is a Coke bottle, and I have it here. And it says, this is in Aramaic, this is in Arabic writing, and it has that kind of scrolly look that you get with the writing. The difference between them, as I said, if it's Hebrew, it's going to look squarish. If it's Arabic, it's going to look kind of like a scrolly thing. Now on the other side of it, it just says, you can see that maybe better there. See the difference in the writing. If I turn it around here, it says Coca-Cola, and there's no doubting that's what it is. This is Arabic writing for Coca-Cola. It's just interesting to see the differences in the way the languages are. So we stopped on the Allenby Bridge, and they let us have drinks and so forth. Then we got back, the air conditioning was fixed, and we started to head for Jerusalem. We went to Jericho first. It was an absolutely beautiful place once we crossed the border, and then we headed for Jerusalem. And you know, the Bible always talks about Jerusalem being up. If you look at the scriptures, it'll say they went up to Jerusalem. Never they went down or they went across. They went up to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is on quite a hill. Now, before we got to Jerusalem, our bus caught fire. And I was in the back of the bus, and it was filling up with smoke, and there was obviously a fire. And so some of the people were screaming, "Stop the bus, it's on fire." And the driver did not want to stop it. And I don't know why. I think what he wanted to do was to get us to Jerusalem before he stopped the bus. But at any rate, there was just too much fire and smoke. Isn't it nice that we've got the sirens behind us? But the men were the ones who were doing the screaming, not the women. So finally they stopped the bus, and they had to have it repaired. So we went through all of this stuff. We went through the fact that the plane was in trouble, and we had to have another plane. We went to the fact that we stayed in a hotel which wasn't the best, and it wasn't the cleanest, and we were surrounded by military people with guns because we were like a day and a half late for the hotel that we were supposed to be at, so we lost that reservation. Then when we crossed the Allenby Bridge, or on the Allenby Bridge, we had to stop the bus for repairs to the air conditioning, and then going on our way to Jerusalem, the bus caught fire. Well, eventually we made it, and we were able to go through a trip, and it was a very nice trip. And then when it was time to leave, we had to go back to Amman, Jordan, to catch another Aliyah jet to fly us home to New York. And wouldn't you know, when we got to the airport, we noticed there were a lot of people there. And what we got involved with was a riot in the airport. At that time, the airport was just really old and not very modern. And Iran and Iraq were at war with each other. Israel was not involved, and Jordan was not involved. But Iran and Iraq were at war with each other. And they were shutting down their airport so no one could leave. And the people living in that area were panicking. They wanted to get out of the area. Jordan was still open. Jordan was not involved with the war, which is probably why it was still open. So there were many, and I say hundreds and hundreds of people that were storming into the Jordanian airport, which, as I said before, was very, very not modern at all, an old airport. And they were trying to get onto planes. They didn't care where they went. They just wanted to get out of the area. So they were trying to get on planes, and there was a rush for the planes, and here we were just entering into the airport so we could get on our plane so we could leave. So security eventually caused us to, kind of snaked us through the people and get us on our plane. But I don't know if you know much about Arabic people, but they seem very volatile. I know we were on a taxi. We took a taxi from Bethlehem to Ramallah because we wanted wanted to meet a pastor who had a church in Ramallah, who was a friend of one of the people that was on the trip. So we tried to take a taxi, and he didn't know exactly where the church was. He could take us to Ramallah, but he didn't know where the church was, although we had the address for him. And he stopped and rolled down his window to ask for directions, and ended up by getting into screaming matches with everybody that he talked to, and then they ended up by getting screaming match back to him. So I find that the people are very volatile. Not the Israelis so much, but the Arabic people. And yet I have to be careful what I say, because we did go to a church, an Arabic church in Ramallah. We did finally get there, and the people were absolutely wonderful. I sat in with our group in a church. Everybody looked somewhat alike, long dark hair, and but they were very nice. And one lady sitting in front of me turned around and said, you know, this music, they were singing music, but they had music. The music books were as large as newspapers. If you opened them up, it was like opening up a small a small newspaper. They didn't have music books like we do. And of course the harmonics were all different, things we were not familiar with, and we couldn't speak the language. So a lady in front of me turned around and said, in perfect English, this music is going to seem odd to you. It's not like Western music. Would you like to have me come back and sit with you and explain to you what's going on? And of course we loved it, and we invited her back, and she was just great. And it turns out she was a librarian that had been educated in the United States. She knew our language well. So I can't say that all Arabic people are volatile, but we found a great many of them that were screaming and yelling and fighting. And when you get into the airport and you have a riotous environment anyway, it's very, very hard to deal with that. So we were able to snake in and get into our plane, which, by the way, was 3 hours late in getting off. And I asked one of there was people on the bus that were acting like guards, on the plane that were acting like guards. And I asked them when we would be taking off. And they said, don't even worry about it. You're supposed to leave at 10, maybe you get there at 11. If you have a problem, you leave at 12. You know, they just don't worry about time. So we started 3 hours late, and of course, getting into New York, we missed our connecting flight to Boston. But these are the things that you have to deal with when you're doing international travel. You never know what's going to happen. You have to just kind of go with the flow. So we went through the riot situation, and we finally got back to the United States soil, and it was good to be back, I can tell you. But it's a wonderful trip to see the Middle East. It makes the Bible come alive. The many things that you hear about the Bible, that you learn about the Bible just by going to church or studying on your own, it comes to life because you actually see it. The Middle East brings the Bible to life. If you're talking about lambs and shepherds, you can walk through the cities and see herds of lambs being herded by shepherds. And if you read the Bible where it talks about the goats and the lambs and separation of the goats and the lambs, you actually see it. So there's a lot of things that you learn about the Bible, and you see it, and it makes sense to you because you're not just reading about it. It's a living demonstration of what's going on. So a lot of times when Jesus was talking, Jesus was teaching people, he used things that were everyday. He would talk about the birds of the air. He would talk about the fish in the sea. He would talk about plants. He would talk about various things that were common in nature that he would have, and he would apply those things to ordinary everyday life. And I think it's important if you're teaching, the purpose of teaching is to help people understand. And so we use natural things that people were familiar with, that they worked with every day, fishing, teaching, learning, family life, all of the things that people were familiar with, and he taught the biblical truths by talking about things that were common in people's everyday life. And I think it's also important for us as teachers today to realize that teaching is to help people to learn and grow. It doesn't have to be complicated. It has to be in such a way that people can understand it. So Jesus always talked about being the good shepherd. He talked about the shepherd. He talked about the sheep, the relationship between shepherds and sheep. And it makes it easy to understand how God takes care of us, because Jesus calls himself the good shepherd, and he calls us the sheep. We are the sheep of his pasture. I'm going to read 2 or 3 verses more or less in succession now. I'm going to read John 10:14 and John 10:27. I'm reading them both. I put them both on the same screen. And I'm reading them from the King James Version. John 10:14 says this: I am the good shepherd, and know my sheep, and am known of mine. And then following that, John 10:27, also of the King James Version, I have it included here. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. What could be more natural than to have the shepherd know the sheep, and the sheep know the shepherd? It's like a family. I know my pets, they know me. They come when I call them. And in terms of human relationships, the child knows the parents, and the parents know the child, and it should be a natural, familiar relationship. I'm going now to read John 10:28. I'm also reading this from the King James Version. And I give unto them eternal life, and they shall never perish, neither shall any man pluck them out of my hand. In other words, once you know God, people can't draw you away from them. It doesn't mean you might not draw yourself away, but at the same time, no one can force you to leave the relationship that you have with God. It's yours, and God will protect you with it. And then on John 10:30, also reading it from the King James Version, I and my Father are one. You see, God always talks in both the New Testament and the Old Testament about the fact that he is God. God is in him, and he is God. It's a triune God that we serve. And then I also want to read Psalm 100, verse 3, also reading from the King James Version. We are his people and the sheep of his pasture. And that explains the relationship of people to God. God, Jesus, is the good shepherd, and we are his people. So you can see the theme of the Old Testament and the New Testament is about the sheep and the shepherd, and how they relate to one another. Now, God will help us will lead us and will take care of us and will help us to understand who he is. You know, there's so much violence in the world today. It's hard to understand how people would put up with it, how people get engaged in it. And I've never been able to understand why people watch television shows that are full of violence. There can't be any good that comes from that. But I'm not the judge, you know. God is the judge. I think that if we live a simpler lifestyle and we're not violent and we stay away from violence, that we are much healthier and better off, and our children are much healthier. And I would not want a child, I've been talking about violence in another show, I would not want a child to grow up and think that violence is a natural way to live. But that's what they see on television. It's not a natural way to live. This is not the way we are supposed to be. And the Gospels show that. God is love. God takes care of us. God gives us what we need. And God resides in us. The Bible says we are the temple of the Holy Spirit, after all. And I think we need to stay away from the violence and not become engaged in it. So I want to undertake probably a series of sermons that have to do with a shepherd and sheep theme, and I'll be talking about the shepherd and the sheep and how God relates to us. I want to show you a book now. I'm going to take some of my information from this book. This is called A Shepherd Looks at Psalm 23. It's been on the bestseller list for years. I think it's still being produced, although I'm not 100% sure of it. I've read this several times, and it talks about the shepherd and the sheep and how they relate to each other and how a good shepherd will take care of his sheep. And what he's referring to is the way that God takes care of us as his people. And it's a wonderful book. It's a comforting book. If you have any kind of distress in your life, then it's handy to read it because it's just a very comforting book. So Psalm 23 starts out by saying, "The Lord is my shepherd." And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read Psalm 23, and it's not going to be on the screen. I'm reading it from a King James version, but it won't be on the screen. And this is what Psalm 23 says. It's used a lot for funerals, but it's for everyday life too. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." Now, if you are to look at that, and we will be looking at that as time goes on, and I'll be taking it section by section, there are just 6 verses to that, but there are 2 parts to every verse. And what it's discussing is the way that the shepherd takes care of the sheep. He anoints it with oil. He works with it. He takes care of it. He makes sure it's healthy. And this is what God does for us. So I am going to close it now because we are pretty much out of time. And then I'm going to go into the shepherd and sheep kind of theme in some of the sermons, not all of them, but some of them. And we will learn just the way that God takes care of us and how we respond to that, and how he is a help to us, and how we can rely upon him. So I'm going to close it off here. Please join me next time.